So this talk will be in English. And today we are have the pleasure to have Stanley Doneman, who is a senior researcher at INRIA and a leader of project Aramis in the ICM, the Paris Brain Institute. So before that, he received a PhD. He prepared a PhD in applied mathematics at University of Nice, and he got habilitation à diriger des recherches from Sorbonne University in Paris. So, his research interests are mainly in the field of applied mathematics for mathematical modeling, statistical learning, for imaging, and in particular for medical data, as we will see today. And Stanley received many awards, and in particular, recently he received the INRIA Académie des Sciences Young Researcher Award, and he got previously an ERC. So today, Stanley will give a talk about modeling and predicting the progression of neurodegenerative diseases. Okay, so please.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurent. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Do you see the screen and you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, perfect. So as you mentioned, I will have the pleasure today to present you the work we have done on the modeling and the prediction of the progression of neurodegenerative diseases. Just to give you a bit more of context, so the first, the most prevalent neurodegenerative disease could be seen a good example. What we will do, and so disease spans several decades. So it started usually by some biological processes, so abnormal accumulation of neurotoxic protein in the brain that we can see and see some modalities of brain imaging. These at the end give rise to the loss of many neurons that, and so that as a consequence, atrophy in the brain that you can see in other types of images, and all these processes at the end give rise to several symptoms: memory loss, confusion, visuospatial impairments, and so on and so forth, which at the end create the handicap of the person, and then start the course of the disease that is the most well known from the general public. So as you can see, you have many different processes. They have a different specific timing and different ordering, and it is quite difficult to understand, especially because all these processes span a very long period of time. So our main goal is to build what we call a digital model of disease progression that can reproduce all these processes in time and in space via the analysis of data. So if we wish, this is a growth curve for the kids, where we report the age, so 9 kilos at month. And as you all know, and standard deviation. So this kid here is within normal range for a certain reference population. This concept cannot be applied directly for the study of neurodegenerative disease or for aging in general, because age is not a good marker of disease progression. Okay, it does not make sense to report the data of a patient at, let's say, 60 years old, as at 60, some patients are already quite advanced in the disease course and others are just starting the disease. So age is not a way you can somehow align the patient. Also, these curves here, despite their, you might think that these curves are drawn from the left to the right and depicts how the kids grow, but actually it's just a collection of mean and standard deviation at different ages. And so this representation does not give you any insights into what the kid would be in 2 or 3 years from now, or 3 months. So it lacks the prediction ability of these types of plots. And also here we have just one marker, which is weight. You know, there is exactly the same type of curve for 8, for instance. But there is no model for the joint distribution of weight and 8. So weight and 8 individually might be normal, but the combination of the two might be not normal. And so we want to extend this for multivariate analysis. And by multivariate, I mean also structured data such as images, which raises, of course, some specific difficulties. So I will depict you now a very simple schematic example to explain you how we extended this concept of growth curve for aging. So focus on the left hand side, and we assume that we measure 2 biomarkers. So we can imagine it's the weight and 8 of a kid, but it probably has something different. So you have 2 biomarkers. One is represented in blue and one in red. And for instance, we have a patient here that we have observed at 4 different time points, and at each age we have 2 measurements. Let's assume for the moment that we have, or we know, the typical progression of these 2 biomarkers during aging. So you have the plain blue and plain red curves, which depicts the model of progression. I will explain you later how this can be estimated, but just assume for the moment it's known. And the core of what we do is to find ways to compare the progression that is observed on the patient to the progression that is predicted by the model. So for this, we define 3 types of operation. We have a time shift that can somehow translate the curve to the left, because obviously the patient has an early onset compared to what the model predicts. So it's an earlier onset individual, and so we need to shift the curve to the left. You can see also that obviously the patient progresses more slowly than on the model curves. So we need another parameter to slow down the progression of the model to accommodate for the different speed of progression of the patient. And even when we have done that, you see that the spacing, the time spacing between the blue and the red curve, it's much larger in the model than what is experienced by the subject. So we need another type of parameters that somehow change the relative timing between the blue and the red curves. And if there is only one thing we have done is to formalize these 3 operations to make sure that a patient can be uniquely decomposed. The progression of the patient can be decomposed along these different dimensions in a unique manner. So now the question is, how do we build the model? That here is the 2 plane curves. So it's not so difficult. We take a longitudinal data set where we observed different patients at different time points. So patient A, patient B, patient C, that we see 4 times, twice, or 3 times. And then we estimate these 2 logistic curves such that the different parameters mapping these curves to the progression of the subject are centered in the population, in the sense that the average time shift is 0, the mean acceleration factor is 1, and the mean of the intermarker spacing are 0. So in some sense, these curves represent the progression of the typical subject in the training population. And you see that the different subjects contribute then to different portions of the curves. Now, I will just tell you exactly the same stories, but just in a different representation. So on the top, everybody understood this is age and the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the normalized biomarker value, but here it's supposed to be between 0 and 1. Now, in the bottom left, in the bottom left, we have the same data represented in a unit square, where we plot the value of the biomarker on the y-axis and the second biomarker on the x-axis between 0 and 1 each. And the 2 plane curves here now build a single curve connecting the corner 0, 0 all the way to the corner 1, 1. And the 4 observations of the subject are represented by the 4 different dots here. And time, no, is implicit in this representation. Okay? It's just the way the curves are parameterized. So you see that time shift and acceleration factors does nothing but changing the time of parameterization of the model curve, the central curve here. Only the last operation translates this curve to adjust for the specific timing of the two biomarkers in the subject compared to the model. And I will show you why this representation is actually more efficient to address this problem. So for now, and the progression of the different subject in the issue. So I just put okay for the model. Despite with the planes over here, you can see that in this representation, the progression of the model one is very typical and very compatible to what has been observed in the training population. So I forgot to mention that what you see here in the central square is the central curve here, plus the standard deviation of all the trajectories that are in the training population that are spread around this central curve. So the subject number 1 is within the normal range of variability, like the number 2. Patient 3 is completely atypical, you see, and that's easy to look because both biomarkers are atypical individually. The blue and the red are completely off what has been observed. 4 is more interesting because if you look individually at the biomarker 1 and 2, both of them have normal values. But if you look at the progression, at the direction of the curve here, the 3 dots here, you see it's completely atypical because in the training, the reference population, subjects tend to be oriented in more diagonal way. And which means that here it's quite atypical to see a sharp increase in the blue biomarkers while observing a steady progression of the red biomarker. So just to give you some insights into how this representation can help to display something which is usually hard to display, which is the temporal progression of data in time. Also, this representation is efficient because this square in the center can be seen as an abstract mathematical space, which is called a Riemannian manifold. And the central curve, which is here, is actually a specific curve on this manifold, which is a geodesic. And we have a spatiotemporal coordinate system around a central curve called the mean progression curve. So it gives us a way to generalize this concept for any kind of data that can be represented on a Riemannian manifold. And to give you some hint here, this is the same representation, but for shapes. So this is a surface mesh of the hippocampus. The central gray line here is exactly the equivalent of the central geodesic here, connecting the 0,0 corner to the 1,1 corner. Okay, and it depicts in the population the typical atrophy of the hippocampus during Alzheimer's disease progression. And the different rows shows you the different parallel curves here, less and less likely to be observed in the training population. So here this is +1, +2, and +3 sigma in the population. So it depicts other types of progression. So it means it's the same type of progression, but in a different anatomy that are less and less likely to be observed. And so you can read also by rows instead by columns instead of reading it by rows, and that each column here represents at a specific disease stage how the shape of the hippocampus can vary across the reference population. So all in one, what we have done here is to define a hierarchical model. So we assume that the longitudinal data that we have derive from the following model. So we assume there is an average trajectory, which is a geodesic and a Riemannian manifold, and which represent the progression of a typical patient. Now, each patient is different from this average trajectory, and it derives from it by adding some random parameters, which allows to change the position of the curve in the Riemannian manifold and also to change the time parametrization of the curve. And the observations are seen as samples along those curves, plus some noise. So on the most difficult part in this example, in this model, is to define here this how we can derive an individual curve from an average curve. The concept of the X parallelization introduced, which allows to generalize parallelization on a Riemannian manifold. So in an abstract way, we can see a geodesic on a manifold with this red curve, defined by a geodesic, so passing by at some point at a point p0 at a time point t0 with a velocity v0. So the advantage of this curve is that it's only parameterized by 3 parameters. And now at one point we can define a tangent vector in the tangent plane of p0, and we can make an exponential map to find another point of the manifold in that direction. And then we can parallel transport the vector along the curve and repeat the Riemannian exponentiation to find another curve, which we call an exponential, an X parallel curve of the manifold. So this curve is no more a geodesic unless in some specific cases. So if you look at the most simple manifold that we can think of, the sphere, the geodesic is a great circle here. And the X parallel curve in one direction is this small piece of red curve here. So this is the blue one are the meridian, and the red one are what we call on the surface of the Hersey parallel. So if you look at the unit square, which is a specific case of Riemannian manifold 001, we have seen that an X parallel to the curve here is for a certain metric. So the X parallelization exactly changes the spacing between the two coordinates. Okay? So it changes the relative dynamics between the red and the blue curve when we X parallel the central geodesic to another location. And the direction of the vector here in the tangent space here of the unit square, divided by much the blue and the red curve will be translated in time. And as I said, this applies also for different types of manifolds that are more difficult to represent. So this is a shape space, which is where the metric is defined by the action of a diffeomorphism. So on the top row here is a shape that is moving. So the guy here is raising the left arm, because this geodesic is defined by this blue arrow here, which tends to deform this part of the shape and to make it move from the bottom to the top. And then we will translate this motion of this silhouette to a different location into the manifold, which means that we have the red arrows that transform this shape on the top to the shape on the bottom. And now we compute the parallel of the top row starting in this point. And that's the different snapshots here that are represented in the bottom line. And you see that this X parallelization translates the motion of the left arm for this new silhouette. So this new silhouette has different shape, but what the parallel does is to make this left arm of this new silhouette to raise from the bottom to the top. Okay? So it's a way you can translate the information of the motion described at the top to a new geometry given by the silhouette on the bottom. So let me recap. So we have a way to represent data in a Riemannian manifold at a prerequisite of the method. then the different points, the different subjects at different time point are seen as point on this Riemann manifold. This might be I-dimensional, but in an abstract way, that's what we have. So we assume that there is a central geodesic that will summarize the typical progression in this population. We derive the individual curves by x-parallelizing the curve on the manifold. And we reparameterize in time the different curves to adjust for the different age at onset and different pace of progression. Now, few important things here. So one is the orthogonality condition here, because the component of this vector, which will be longitudinal here, would make an interplay with the acceleration factor. So this is important to ensure a unique decomposition between the time reparameterization function and the x-parallelization. And that has been quite a challenge in the statistical community to define identifiable model in longitudinal data analysis. And we see that this geometrical approach allows us to solve this problem by a very simple orthogonality condition. Another important point is that so we define here the x-parallelization by specifying a specific point on the geodesic. But actually, there is a notion of invariance because the parallel transport is an isometry. So we could have defined the distribution of this vector at different points on the geodesic without changing the model. And that's why also this model is compatible with time reparameterization function. And so in that model, the time, so as I said, is not a marker of progression, it's not a covariate, but it becomes a random variable. So at the end of the day, we have a mixed effect model where the fixed effect are the parameters of the central geodesic. And we have different random effects, so subject-specific parameters, so the acceleration factor, the time shift, and all this intermaker spacing, which is called here space shift in a more general setting. And the application of the model on the silhouette is as follows. So we start with the data set at the beginning is the red silhouettes. So data are the 3 time points, the three silhouettes observed at 3 time points for different subjects. And what we estimate is the central geodesic, which is this idealized motion of the idealized silhouette and idealized motion of its silhouette. And then we translate back this to all the subject space to somehow reconstruct from the subject data the whole continuous trajectory of change. And so when we glue to all the pieces together, so we can construct from a longitudinal data set the natural history of Alzheimer's disease progression. Well, you see over 30 years of age, how the disease, the consequence of the disease and the cortical sickness. So this is the sickness of the cortex. So the red is the more thick, and it becomes more and more bluish as the cortex decreases in time. Here is the consumption of the glucose in the brain, which is a proxy of the neuronal loss in different regions of the brain. So very dark areas mean high glucose consumption, and as the disease progresses, the color becomes brighter and brighter as more and more glucose is consumed. In the left is the atrophy of the hippocampus that we have seen before. So as one loses neurons, the shape of the hippocampus is changing over time. And all that is synchronized with the progressive onset of the different symptoms. So starting with the memory loss, then language practice, concentration, impairment. And so it's noticeable that we can reconstruct a long-term scenario of change over 30 years of age, whereas in the data set, we have never observed a patient more than 10 years at the very maximum. And you understood that this is the average typical presentation, and we have different types of parameters which can change, so the pace of progression and the age at onset, but also the shape and the appearance of the image data, or the timing, the relative timing between the onset of the different cognitive functions. Yeah, for sake of time, I will go very quick on that. So what we do to estimate the parameters given the data is variance of the expectation maximization algorithm, so which is a very generic class of methods, which is combined with stochastic approximation and with MCMC procedure to sample the posterior distribution. So this is very in line with what Eric Moulin, Marc Lavielle have done over the years, and Stéphanie Lassonnière also, with different improvements on these methods. And so I refer to their work for more details, and I will repeat to answer questions if you have afterwards. So I promise to show you some more specific examples on real clinical data. So I already show you some quick example on Alzheimer's disease, but now I will be a bit more specific and precise. And so I choose to illustrate this on the Huntington disease, and to show you also some application of this for clinical trial design. So Huntington disease is a genetic disease that is caused by the very high repeats of the CAG nucleotides in the Huntington genes. Now the number of repeats is associated with usually an earlier onset and more aggressive form of the disease. So we use the two data sets. So the data from the TRACK-HD and TRACK-ON studies for 100 individuals as a training data set. And we have a certain number of visits for each subject, so between 2 and 7 visits for different subjects. And we will use the annual HD dataset as a test dataset, which consists of 11,510 subjects with also a different number of visits. And we will have different data. We have clinical endpoints, which really relates the symptoms of the disease. So one of the important one is a total motor score, which is a rating of you can guess the motor capacity of the patient, the subject. The capacity, problem behavior assessment, we are just a different aspect of the subject. There is more cognitive endpoints. So it's a scale that's different cognitive capacity, the functions of the subject. And we also have, for the TRACK studies, some imaging biomarkers, which consist of the volumetric measurement of different areas of the brain that are known to experience atrophy during disease progression. So we used the data of the TRACK studies to so this is a longitudinal data set, and we use our model to summarize the range of disease trajectory that has been observed in this population. So we have 15 different types of biomarkers. So what the model does at the end is to display the typical progression of these 15 biomarkers in time. So the x-axis is the age of the typical patient that we call an Huntingtonian age. You can think of it as a disease stage. Okay, so an idealized timeline, if you wish, and we see how the different biomarkers change. So some are already, so some deviation from the most normal value already at the beginning, and they more or less all progress. So all the biomarkers have been normalized, so that 0 value means the most normal value, and 1 is the maximum pathological change. So what we do is, it's quite difficult to read this. So what we do is to find a threshold here on the normalized biomarker value that best separate controls from patients. And so we can compute by contrasting the two different distributions. We have a different threshold that we report here on the y-axis and define so the age at which one biomarker becomes abnormal or atypical. And so we derive from the 15 different curves this type of sequence of events. So starting with very early deterioration of the total motor score at a very conservative value here, followed by different impairment that we can see in the images, which is quite expected, followed by more cognitive impairment. And then we have the global measure of the brain, which are quite not very specific, followed by the most cognitive impairment at the late stage of the disease, which overall is in line with our current knowledge of the disease, except that now this is embedded into a computational model that we will see. This main propagation curve, and as you understood, there are different parameters that adjust for the individual differences. So individuals in this dataset might have early or late onset, maybe fast or slow progressor, or might present disease in different ways, in the sense that the timing and ordering of the different biomarkers might be different from one subject from another one. So for each subject in the training dataset, we have a series of parameters characterizing the specificities of the progression of the subject compared to the average curves. So here we did the simple association studies where we did a regression of these parameters against gender, the number of CAG repeats in the huntingtin gene, the level of mitigation, the number of visits we have seen the patient attendance. So this is to correct for possible biases in the association. And now this model can allow us to quantify things that has been done before, is that for every additional seizure repeats, the disease starts, so not only earlier, but now we can say 2.4 years earlier. And the rate of progression is multiplied by 1.043. And those effects are statistically significant. And we also can see that the increased CAG repeats advanced also the degradation of different cognitive tests and other brain imaging measurements. And we didn't find any association, for instance, in the pace of progression of age at onset with sex or level of education, for instance. Oops. So we can do more visual representation. So here, what we plot here is two of these parameters, subject-specific parameters. So on the x-axis is the time shift. So on the left, we have the early converters, and the right, the late converters. And on the y-axis is the acceleration factor. So at the bottom, there is a slow progressor, and at the top, the fast progressor. Each dot corresponds to one subject. So these two parameters characterize the entire trajectory of this subject. So what is interesting is that this track study is a very specific design. They started by acquiring the data for the track HD study. And then they decided to start another study, which is TRACK-ON, but they included some of the participants from track HD to follow them up in TRACK-ON. So there is an intersection between the two studies. And what is interesting is to see that in red, you have the patient in track HD, the first study, that has not been followed in TRACK-ON. And you see that this patient is the fastest progressor, which is not surprising, probably because when they started the TRACK-ON later on, probably this patient didn't meet the inclusion criteria anymore. And conversely, the one who were included in the follow-up studies were the latest converter. And here on the right-hand side, what I show is so Huntington age, so to reach the disease stage of the participant at baseline, at the time they were included into the study. And you see that, again, the patient we were not follow-up in TRACK-ON, where the patient were included also at the latest disease stage. So they were not only the fastest progressors, but they were also included at the later disease stage. And conversely, the TRACK-ON were the one who were included at the earliest disease stage. Because you might be a fast progressor, but be included very early on or later on in the disease course. So here you see the interest of the method to position the different subject progression relative to the other ones. So one interest of this model is not only to do descriptive analysis, even if I think it's already something important because description of dynamical progression is often difficult. But it also allows us to forecast the disease progression forward in time. So the concept is extremely simple. So what we have done so far is to compute here a model on a longitudinal data set. So here we use the tracked participants. I use four endpoints just for the sake of simplicity. Now I will take a subject from a new data set, Enroll-HD, an independent data set. I will use the baseline data of this participant, and I will report here, for instance, the 4 different values of for this participant. Now I can use the maximum likelihood approach to find what are the best or the optimal parameters to adjust the curve to these baseline measurements. So this is the most likely, according to my model, the most likely trajectory of progression for this model, for this participant. So this participant, for instance, is now at 77 years old. And I will read in these curves what I suspect this patient to be at 80 years old, so 3 years in time from now. And of course, I will use the true follow-up data of this participant to see how far off is my prediction compared to the truth. So here, that's the crude number of the mean absolute error and the prediction of the total motor score in Enroll-HD participant, when the model has been trained on the tracked HD participants. And so we compare to 2 different alternatives. So a linear mixed effect model and another scenario, which is a no change scenario where in this scenario, one assumes that the data has not changed over time. And which is often for this low progressing disease is quite a good prediction, especially at a over a short period of time. But here in that occasion, we see that we have significantly better prediction compared to these 2 alternatives from 2 years onwards. And we did that also for all the different features. So I'll just show you a second one, and you see that at 1 year, the no change scenario is actually the best predictor. But after a few years, of course, a more sophisticated model wins. On a side note, we did much more extensive evaluation in Alzheimer's disease, and we compared in a challenge, and where we have better accuracy than lower mean absolute error compared to 56 different alternatives. So the interest of predicting the progression for clinical trials is that so you can derive a prognosis score. So we can measure the amount of change for a specific biomarker that we predict. And we can use that to split or to identify within the participant the one who will experience a significant change in the endpoint, for instance, during a clinical trial. This has been a subject of interest for, of course, other groups. And currently in the Huntington disease, there are 2 different methods. Index, if you wish, that are used to identify the participant that we think will progress significantly in the next years. And so the goal is to see if we can identify this subject better than these alternatives. So here, for instance, the goal is within the Enroll-HD participants to select the ones who will experience an increase of their total motor score of at least 15% in 3 years. Okay, so the participant I want to select. So using the prediction and using a threshold on this prediction, I can build a ROC curve to see how well I could identify those participants in the whole Enroll-HD dataset. And so you find that using our method, we have an AUC of 71%. And for instance, in this specific task, the alternatives that are currently used in practice does not perform so well. And we can do that by varying the time to prediction. So instead of using 3 years, you can do 1, 2, or 4 years, and changing this 15% by 5%, 10%, up to 20%. And in all occasions, you see that the forecasts we did in disease progression are better accuracy to target the progressing participants compared to the alternatives. And that's true also if we change the TMS for the Stroop, and that's true also for other types of data. So now the idea is to use this to select in a clinical trial only the patient who will significantly progress during the trial duration. Why? Because, so imagine we have this subject who has this type of profile. You include the patient today and he is at this disease stage. Even if you have an effective drug that can slow down the disease progression, there is no way you can show that, because even without the drug, even a placebo here would not progress much during the trial. So there is no hope of showing a significant effect if you include a patient so early. Conversely, if we include a patient who has this type of profile and you include this not too early, but at the right time where just before you will experience a sharp increase in the endpoints, and then you will increase the effect size that you can see between a treated and a placebo arm. So to validate that, we simulate clinical trials. So we use all the Enroll-HD data as, let's say, the participant you can see in a routine care. We select them using the usual criteria that are used today in clinical trials. So we select, for instance, the participants we have a total functional capacity between 7 and 10, which is typically what is done today. And our claim is to say that within this population, is very heterogeneous, and we have participants at too many different disease to various disease stages. And we need to be more precise. So we will sub-select this participant by saying, well, I want in these only the one for whom I suspect a significant progression of the endpoints during the trial duration. So I will use my method, but also you will use the cap and the pin, the two alternatives that I've shown before. And then I will, in this sub-selected population, I will simulate the effect of a drug and to compute the sample size needed to show an hypothetical treatment effect. So here is the usual curve, which in the x-axis is the hypothetical treatment effect. So 0.35 here means I hypothetically have a drug that could decrease by 35% the rate of change of the total motor score. And here is the sample size that's required to show this effect. So without sub-selection, using the usual standard criteria as of today, the effect is quite small, it's diluted. So you need more than 400 subjects to show this effect. And using our selection methods, where we select only the progressor, you can more than half the number of participants needed to show the same effect. And you see that the other index that has been proposed to select the progressors also decrease the sample size for the fixed treatment effects, but to a smaller extent. And of course, we can do that by varying the choice of the outcome, the initial selection criteria, and the different and the trial duration. In nearly all occasions, we can significantly decrease the sample size required in a clinical trial. So just time to conclude to allow for time for questions. So what we did is to propose a model of disease progression that is learned from longitudinal data. And I would say the main message is that this method can disentangle different aspects of this progression and can differentiate what relates to the difference in dynamic of progression to the disease presentation. So at the same time, so what refers to the age at onset of pace of progression on one hand, and the relative timing and ordering of the different symptoms or events during disease progression on the other hand. So this model does not only describe the progression of different lesions among themselves, but also to forecast the progression of the different endpoints and biomarkers in time. So I've shown you application in Huntington disease, but we have replicated that in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease as well. And so now we have quite extensive experience in this modeling with more than 25,000 patients data analyzed to date. So we have shown that in a challenge that in Alzheimer's disease, we can more accurately predict the cognitive decline compared to all the competitors. And that can be used to decrease the sample size in clinical trial by focusing on the participants that are the most likely to experience a significant increase of the outcome during the trial. There is some publication that can refer you to. And I would finish by mentioning the LeapSpy software, which is an open source software, which implements all the methods I have presented. So there is a GitLab repository. The address is there. There's also tutorials and demos. And I will end by saying that there is a course, an hands-on session at the next AI for Health Winter School organized by Prairie and the Health Data Hub. And so registration are still open. So feel free to register and see you there if you wish. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any question you may have.
Thank you very much for this talk, San and Sanlai. And so it's time for questions. So who would like to?
I have a question, Jean.
Yes, Jean.
I missed the very beginning, so maybe I missed the explanation, but I'm always curious. Do you assume that your data lies on a Riemannian manifold? How do you know that this is the case?
So I don't know if this is the case. It's a modeling assumption. So we have a way to embed the data on a Riemannian manifold. If it's not possible, data can be represented. For instance, so the way we did usually these biomarkers, and they lie therefore in a cube, in a hypercube, 0, 1 to the power of the number of biomarkers, and then it's our choice to find a metric on this hypercube, which at the end prescribe the specific shape of the curves. So the user decide of the metric on the manifold. And we have recently extended this work to learn the metric on the data, which is something I have not presented here.
Because so I don't know for medical data, but for images, to me, people often say that they lie on manifolds, but to me, it's not obvious at all. You can represent them in Rn as something in Rn, but the natural images, for example, it's not clear to me at all that they lie on any well-defined manifold. And is there something specific in your data that makes you believe that, or is just a modeling assumption and then it works and so that's sufficient?
So what your question is, because you say you can embed images in Rn, so Rn is a manifold.
Of course, but in Rn they occupy a very small part.
Yes.
And that very small part, I've no information suggesting that it may have a manifold structure. I'm not saying that this is not, in your case, it might be justified. That's why I'm curious, because for images, I don't know that this is the case.
Okay, yeah, but I would like to precise your question. So when you say that there is no, your question relates to the regularity assumption of the manifold. You mean that you might have in Rn two images that are very close to each other, but it kind of discontinuity in them?
I don't mean to take too much of your time, but for example, there are people who say if you take all the pictures of an object, it's parameterized by the position of the camera, so there are only 6 degrees of freedom. So in Rn, where n is the number of pixels, it might be a 6-dimensional manifold, except that because of occlusion and things like that, is another reason why it should be smooth. And those are when you just have change in viewpoint. When you have more complicated effects, it's much more complicated, and natural images are, we don't know how to define them naturally, mathematically, etc. So it's a very different domain from yours.
Yeah, okay, no, I
I
got
think
your question.
it's something that suggests in your domain that it has a manifold structure.
Yeah, so definitely in the manifold field, I think the manifold assumption is more reasonable than what you described in a natural image. Why? Because I mean, what we look at is a clinical scales that are built to evolve, I would say, regularly and smoothly in time, so without type of discontinuities. And medical imaging, you have no occlusion. And again, when the way a brain changes during disease progression is very smooth.
So
Also, it might be dramatic, and you might experience a great change, but these changes are quite smooth.
Okay.
So the assumption that there is a manifold yet possibility to discover for which the progression is a geodetic and this manifold, I think it's not proven, of course, but it's reasonable, and I think and in practice it works well because I think this assumption is valid.
Okay, thank you. No, it works well, that's for sure. So, thank you.
So there is a question from Alexandre Blanc, which is in the discussion. So maybe you cannot, don't have a mic. So the question is in the discussion. So do you envision? Oh, okay. So do you envision a future in which these methods provide predictions that are good enough to dispense from the usage of the control group, meaning that all subjects get to be treated and still show the drug's effect in a statistically meaningful way?
That's a good question. Yes, yes, I think exactly to generate what we call the synthetic control arm, where each subject can be seen as its own control. The model, the natural progression of the disease. So it will be exactly what the patient would be without the intervention. And then we can use what is observed after intervention to measure the discrepancy between the two and use that as an outcome that can be computed without a placebo group. And as you mentioned, that's only possible if the prediction is accurate enough. And that is at least something we are working on. So yes, I hope it will be there in the near future.
Okay, so there in the discussions also somebody asked for if you could share the presentation with the public. Usually the video will be put on the websites soon. Can the slides as well, can I put there, or can you share the slides as well?
Yeah, sure, I could, yeah.
Okay. So are there any other questions? Okay. So, okay. So, I'm just curious about something in this test that you do. The people are they aware of the results of the test? Or I mean, if you don't have a reliable treatment for Alzheimer, for example, do people know what is your prediction and what is it useful that they know?
This is a very good question. So at the moment, I mean, most of the work I have presented has been done offline. I mean, it has been done using anonymous research data, so without any type of relationship with the patient. So now we are exploring this in a patient. I would say so. There are different contexts of use. But to be included into this trial or not. And you don't necessarily need to explain that there is an algorithm that runs behind and are expected to be a fast or slow progress. Even though you can disclude, I mean, is a matter of it's a cultural matter. In the clinical practice, I do think, and I mean, at least at the personal level, that sharing with the patient some information about the prognosis is important, even in absence of a treatment. And different, their opinion differs, and some still argue should not do exactly the contrary. Important. Okay, my approach is that to have a lesser extent of anxiety and be able to use, we call the cognitive reserve, the disease. It's an hypothesis and that needs to be tested, but at least that's my belief.
Okay, so are there any other questions? Okay, so in this case, we thank again Stanley for this excellent talk, and see you.
Thank you very much.
Next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.